This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. Okay, we're really excited to get to speak with Shaul Magid today. Professor Magid teaches modern Judaism at Harvard Divinity School. His most recent book is The Necessity of Exile, Essays from a Distance, published in 2024. And he's the author of several other books, including American Post-Judaism, Identity and Renewal in a Post-Ethnic Society, Hasidism Incarnate, Hasidism, Christianity, and the Construction of Modern Judaism, and Meir Kahana, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical. Shaul, congratulations on your most recent book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel.
So you've been at a few different institutions over the years, Indiana, Dartmouth, now Harvard Divinity School. I'm curious how these different institutions have influenced your writing, if they have.
That's a good question. I would start actually with the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I was for 9 years before I moved to Indiana University. And each one of those places are actually my experience is each of the places is very different. A rabbinical school, a public university, a small private liberal arts college, and a divinity school. I think each one has influenced it a great deal. I don't think that I would have written American Post-Judaism had I stayed at JTS. I think that it was really moving to a large public university where I was able to engage with scholars of religion, scholars of American religion, Americanists more generally, that really kind of exposed me to a much broader world of American religion that allowed me to think more kind of theoretically about these questions that were, for lack of a better term, I guess, thought about in a more parochial context at a place like JTS. In terms of writing, that's a really good question. I do think that a lot of my early writing was somewhat insular. I was writing for a kind of particularly Jewish studies audience. I was teaching rabbinical students. They had certain kinds of questions. I think that moving to a public university forced me to read more widely, but actually write for a broader audience and be able to kind of conceptualize and translate and think more carefully about who was reading what I was writing and how that was done. I think at that time I also started writing, which maybe we'll get to, for more popular journals, online journals and venues, and that really changed my writing a great deal. I mean, I think that in a certain sense, writing for topical journals transformed the way I understood myself as a writer.
Was that partly because of what you were getting back editorially from them?
That's part of it. I think that's a separate part of it, which I think is worth talking about. But more generally, to think about the balance between making a kind of incisive or nuanced argument and doing it in a way that was more accessible was the kind of dance. And also, and I think this is for me really important, writing a 3,000 word essay is really something that we're not trained to do in graduate school. In fact, we're trained to do the opposite. We're trained to write, more expansively, more wordy, and the like writing for an online journal, like writing a 3,000 word or a 2,500 word essay. It's really it's like it's got to be kind of fat free. It's like going to the gym. It's like being on a treadmill. It's like every sentence counts, every locution counts. and you have to think carefully. Can I say this in a more concise way? How can I shrink these things down? It was really a lesson in writing more than anything else. And I think it really made me a better writer. And it certainly made me think about writing in ways that I didn't think about when I went to graduate school. I mean, I don't know what your experience was at graduate school, but certainly when I went to graduate school, nobody talked about writing. Nobody saw writing as a craft. It was just something that, it was the way in which we communicated our research. And I think there's a difference between that and writing. I often, when I talk about this with students, I often say that one can approach writing as a scientific exercise or as an artistic exercise. And as scholars, we're trained to be scientists as writers. But I think the really great scholars, and I could just name a couple, but the really great scholars were really artists as writers. I mean, I think Gershom Scholem, what people don't pay attention to is actually how incredible he was as a writer. And that was part of his, I think, that was part of his greatness as a scholar.
Yeah. What you said about how this has influenced your writing for popular pieces made me wonder too about how you choose what topics to maybe pitch for a more popular piece. I know for me, sometimes actually when I'm in the archives or doing research, something comes up and it really is almost like kind of a light goes off and I'm a little bit of like, oh, this is of more general interest. This is that level of it's not just for the specialist, or I can sort of already start imagining how I would tell the story of it. How do you know what you want to write more popularly?
I think it's probably similar. Coming across something, either an article or something in a text or something in an archive, and just something pops out and says, "Oh, this can contribute to the larger conversation."
Hmm.
And I think for me, as a scholar, as a public intellectual, I think there are two parts to it. The one is, in what way can I contribute to an ongoing conversation? And the other one is, in what way can I influence a conversation?
Mm.
And I think that it kind of, for me, goes back and forth in a certain way. I mean, I had a lot of this experience in writing my Kahana book, for example, which maybe we'll get to talk about a little bit more. And it's like, as a scholar who also is invested in the larger conversation, I think we're doing kind of two things at the same time. On the one hand, we're trying to produce knowledge, that's what scholars do. And on the other hand, we're trying to kind of contribute to a larger conversation, and very often feel frustrated about the direction that that conversation is going, or the way we think that it's missing this thing and that thing. And this is really before social media. Social media adds a whole other layer to it. Certainly something like Facebook. I mean, I'm not really on Instagram or Twitter, but certainly in terms of Facebook, that's really changed my writing persona in ways that I don't necessarily think are particularly edifying. Because um, it's not a conversation that really is. It's not a conversation that unfolds in a thoughtful manner. It's more a conversation that it's just one person is reacting to another person, reacting to another person. And very often I feel like, I'm on a treadmill, like I'm not going anywhere. I'm just saying the same thing over and over again, or talking to the same people. So I think that's something else that scholars have had to make a choice. I mean, I know many scholars, I'm sure you do, who like are not on social media at all. And I know others who saw social media as this great opportunity to exercise their expertise, so to speak. Although I think, in a way, social media has this war against expertise, right? The democratization of knowledge. Everybody can say anything they want, and it's of equal merit. And so I think that's frustrating for a lot of us. But I do, I also know that there are a lot of colleagues that shy away from writing for topical journals, because they see it as somehow either watering something down, or they see it as a waste of time. I never thought of it that way. I always felt like I wanted to be a part of something larger than the academy.
Hmm. Yeah. As you were talking about being at these different institutions, JTS, Indiana, I was thinking too of we had a conversation with Ellie Stern several episodes back, and we were talking about writing books and learning over time how much you need a community of other scholars. You like actually need friends to be able to send your chapters to. You need to know which friends are good for which stage of writing. And so I'm wondering if over time in your academic career, have you also found that the need for other readers, have you maintained some of these relationships with other academics where you exchange chapters or writing? Um, can you tell us about your own process of discovering what you needed from other people to help with your own writing?
I definitely felt that, and I definitely feel that, and I do have a community of people who, because I write on a variety of things in different fields. So within those various fields, and when I'm writing on American Judaism, or if I'm writing on Hasidism, or I'm writing on Kabbalah, who I really feel very dependent on. Um, take me to task, tell me where this argument doesn't work, what am I missing? And it's tough because you're inviting critique, and critique hurts and it stings. And, if people are honest, they're not going to write back and tell you that everything that you write is great, because then, it comes out and everyone says, well, that's not true. So there is a process. I think there's a process of criticism that is very healthy within the process of writing. Not to say that the criticism doesn't happen when it's out in the world, but that when it's out in the world, it's already gone through a series of critical layers, which helps you kind of hone things. And I think this is true not only in terms of, well, you missed that source or you misread that source, but, your writing isn't clear here. I mean, I think a lot of it, I ask people that I send things to, like, tell me what you think. Is it written clearly? Is it written well? I really do take a lot of pride and take a lot of time in my writing, and I do, in some sense, like, I consider myself a scholar. That's what I do. That's what we do. But I also actually identify as being a writer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I had a student here at Harvard, Alice Hoffman, who's a great novelist,
Mm-hmm.
and she was like trying to convince me to write fiction, and uh, she was telling me why. She was giving me all of the reasons why. I'm petrified. I'm petrified of poetry, and I'm petrified of fiction for a
Mm-hmm.
variety of reasons. And because she was telling me, like, I can't write an academic paper, I don't know how to do it, but give her some data and information, and she can come up with this fabulous, fantastic story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'd like to try.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to try to do that, because it's an interesting experiment with words
Mm-hmm.
and with creating worlds. And in a certain sense, as scholars, we're doing that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, listeners might be wondering, or, maybe someone's thinking, gee, I don't know if I have those people in my academic life right now that would be willing to do that. How do you cultivate those relationships?
Some of them go back to graduate school. Some of them really go back to different kinds of, academic workshops that I've been involved in.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them is just bugging people
Mm-hmm.
and getting people to, we're all trying to get people to read what we write, and people are trying to get us to read what they write. And there's a certain kind of time commitment that is, I think, um, not required of us, but I think it's really beneficial for us to do that. And I do that even if I agree to read people, like if I agree to read for journals. So we all kind of do that. And so, that's a learning experience. I mean, look, it's a time commitment, but it's a learning experience not only on the level of argument and subject, but also on the level of how people write. I
Yeah.
mean, when you read a piece of scholarship that's written well, there's something that just sparkles about it. And then you read another piece of scholarships that's really not written well, and it might be a really good argument, and it might be a really good, interesting contribution, but it's just sometimes painful to get through.
Yeah. I'm wondering, you mentioned the Mayor Kahana book. This is I don't know how you would describe it. I think of it as a kind of biography, but it's written about someone who many people find despicable. What was that like for you to maybe try to write sympathetically about someone that many readers might feel something like the opposite towards?
Um, Not only other readers, I mean myself.
Yeah.
I think it was interesting. I don't think that I've ever really done that before. I've done it since a little bit, but I've never really done it before. And for example, taking, let's say, the writing that I've done on Meir Kahana and writing that I've done, let's say, on Zalman Schachter Shalomi, one figure I find I feel very little in common with, and in the other figure I feel very, very kind of simpatico with. I think with Kahana, what was so exciting to me about Kahana in researching him, and that was the first book, by the way. I know that you're a person that's really kind of you're an archive person, and it was the first academic project that I ever did in archives. It was the first time I ever worked in archives. So when I went to the Center for Jewish History when I was a NEH fellow there, and I just went to the archivist and I said, okay, like, teach me how to do this. I really have no idea. And it was this great experience. And it's really, for those people who have never really worked in archives, it's really, really an incredible experience. Just on the emotionally, like, you just enter into people's worlds and you enter into reading things that were not meant to be read and all of those kinds of things. Um, I I came to I would say it this way. I didn't never came to like Kahana, but I came to really understand him. And I came to see what he was thinking about, and that he actually had a coherent worldview that I felt was misunderstood, and that articulating that worldview in a way that was both expansive and also close to his own thought really was a contribution, because I feel like there are many people that actually think more like him than they would like to admit.
Hmm.
And suddenly, presenting him, in this model. When I first started working on the Kahana book, somebody said, well, are you writing a biography? And I said, well, it's not really a biography. I'm really writing about his thought. And they said, well, Kahana has no thought. Right. And I said, that's why I have to write the book,
Mm.
because I don't think that that's true.
Hmm.
I think there's actually a coherent worldview that you might not agree with, but it certainly is something that is influential and should be part of American Judaism. I mean, one of the things that I could say it in this podcast because I actually said it in the book, is that when I was working through some of the material with Kahana's book, I went and looked something up in Jonathan Sarna's American Judaism, which is the kind of definitive study, at least after Glatzer's book, which I, by the way, learned an incredible amount from your work about Nathan Glatzer's American Judaism. But I realized that there's not one mention of Kahana in the book, and that was not by mistake. And so I realized that he was intentionally being erased from the American Jewish story. And I felt like there was something deeply missing in post-war American Judaism, certainly late 20th century American Judaism, if that person and the influence that he had and the movement that he had was somehow erased. So it was really a sense of bringing something back to life, which I felt really needed to be part of the story that needed to be told.
Yeah, I wonder if that's been a motivation for you when you're writing, this feeling of a figure or idea that's been misunderstood. I felt that a little bit too in when you and I were communicating. I was telling you I read this piece you wrote on David Dean for Tablet, which I really enjoyed reading. I was curious what the writing or editing process for that was like. But it was, again, someone I didn't know I was interested in reading about, but you made his life story really engaging. Um, and so I'm curious, if has biography become a more important genre for you?
I think so, but not by intention.
Hmm.
I just think that, I mean, the David story is a complicated one because there's parts of the story that I really can't tell. And I published another piece in commemoration of his yurtzeit in Jew school this summer,
Mm-hmm.
which was part of a version of a paper I gave at a conference on Kabbalah in America that came out as a book at Rice University. Yeah, um, I think that interesting lives are incredibly generative for me as a person. Just maybe as I get older too, I see that the relationship between how a person thinks and who they are as an individual, and especially with someone like Davidin who didn't write anything and actually like was influential for a very short period of time, really about 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I just there found that there was something. Oh, it was an outsized life. I mean, I had this experience when I read Derek Penslar's biography of Herzl for the Jewish Life series, and I realized from reading his book that like Herzl comes onto the scene publicly in like 1896, and by 1904 he's dead.
Mm.
The whole story is
Mm-hmm.
like 6 years.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and yet it's like it's like the Beatles come to America in 1963, and then they disband in 1969.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow people can be public figures for a very short period of time and have this incredibly intense impact
Mm-hmm.
on the world. I mean, Isaac Luria comes to Tzfat, and 18 months later he's dead, and yet he completely revolutionizes Jewish mysticism. So there's something that's very compelling about those short, intense lives that enter into the world, leave the world, and then change the world
Mm-hmm.
going forward.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess for David Dean, it was partly to, um, I don't know if the first reason you wrote about him was his son's memoir, and so it felt like part of what you were doing is like there's more to this story, and actually, Shalom Dean he didn't spend much time in his own memoir talking about his father, so. I know I see that as a move you are sometimes making in your scholarship of sort of showing us, like you didn't know there was this extra layer. I don't know if that's something you were feeling you were also doing with Hasidism earlier in your career.
Yeah, the thing with David is that he really was my first teacher. So I mean, I have a very kind of deep sense of having absorbed him and then having left him because we had a falling out, but I never really left. I mean, everything I do is very much, I think, influenced by him in all kinds of strange ways. It is true that, and I think that Daniel Schwartz, in his review of The Necessity of Exile in the Jewish Review of Books, he kind of noted this, and he was right about it, that I've really been attracted to marginal figures in terms of my own scholarship, whether it's Mordechai Yosef of Ishbitz or Nachman of Bratslav or Isaac Luria, who obviously is a mainstream figure, but figures who are not kind of normative figures who are kind of pushing boundaries. So I think for me, it's always been a question of the boundary of heresy, of transgression, of the elasticity of the tradition. Those are the things that just always, that's what they attract me. I think Kahan is that way as well. I think that I'm working on Yol Taidabam of Satmar now. Also, because I think that that's where, and I'm sure there are many listeners who'll disagree, right? I feel like that's where the real creativity is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's on the margins.
Mm-hmm.
It's people that are pushing back, people that are resisting against conventions, and in a variety of ways, political ways, spiritual ways, religious ways, literary ways. So that's just, I in a certain sense, I don't think my academic career has been consciously tactical. I think I just followed the things I really liked, and in a certain sense was lucky enough to get them published.
Yeah, no, I feel that about the margins. Also, I'm in working in this biography of Laura Z. Hobson. She was never part of a Jewish community, She wasn't even always understood to be Jewish. People just sort of saw her name and assumed she wasn't. But she writes this most important American novel about anti-Semitism. It does feel like these people on the margins often have some insight. She saw the problem from a different angle because she was so used to being around non-Jews. So she was able to write it in this way that then spoke to a broader audience. So, I agree with you. Those are often really helpful perspectives. You mentioned your career, how it just sort of come about. This wasn't all conscious decisions, but I was curious about this shift that it seems like you've moved more to the public intellectual space, maybe within the past 10 to 15 years. Do you see this as a result of the kind of writing you've wanted to do or ended up doing, or how did this move happen for you?
I think that was a bit more conscious on my part. I think that I just felt the desire to be more out there and felt that I had something to contribute. I think it really happened when I wrote a piece for Tablet, and then they asked me if I wanted to actually write for them, on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, which I agreed doing. And I did it for 5 or 6 years before I decided to leave for a variety of reasons having to do more with ideology than anything else. But I will say that, even though Tablet and I parted ways on questions of ideology, they were very, very generous, and I never sent them something that they said, we won't publish this. Um, so I think I commend them for that, even though our ideas may differ. And I did feel I did feel and I do feel that a lot of that popular writing is very generative for scholarship. I don't really see both sides of my I don't see my scholarly side and my more topical side as being that distinct. I think they're really woven into each other. And the necessity of exile book came out of, or at least four of the chapters were actually expanded versions of things I had written in topical journals. It is, the other thing that's interesting is that there is a different editorial process when you're writing for a trade press as opposed to writing for an academic press, or you're writing for a topical journal. And that took something that took some getting used to for me, because in university press writing, very often the editors are not necessarily paying that much attention to the writing itself. They want the argument to be good. They want there to be the facts to be correct. Whereas when you're writing for a trade press or you're writing for a topical journal, they have the readership in mind, right? So they're very, very careful, and the editing process of writing for a more more trade press or topical journal context can be excruciating for a scholar. And I will say that, having suffered through a lot of that, I think that I'm a better writer because of it, even though it was not pleasant.
Can you tell us what was difficult about it?
um basically writing a paragraph that you thought was, like, really incisive, or saying something new, and the person, the editor, coming back and saying that, this is not convincing, this does not have enough nuance, or this is too academic. That's very often, right? This is too academic. You're writing for too limited an audience. How can you say the same thing in a more general way? And it's not about watering something down. That's actually, I think, a misnomer. It's about clarity and precision, and just getting that sense of writing something that you just read the paragraph, whether it's yours or somebody else's, and you just say, wow, that was a really good paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't even care what it said. It was just, and look, we all read great writers, and when that happens, when you see that happen, it's exhilarating.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you write about literature more than I do, and so you're writing about writers, many of whom are really, really good writers. I mean, let's say Philip Roth or something like that, Saul Bellow. And um, it's probably, challenging, how do you write about a writer in a way that is written comparable to the way he or she wrote.
Right.
It's hard to do. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's probably frightening to do,
Mm-hmm.
actually.
Yeah.
You know, when you write about philosophy, theology, I mean, they're not good writers, right? So you don't
Mm-hmm.
have the bar is not that high. Right?
Yeah. So I guess I wonder, are you thinking about trade press books then? It seems like you're sort of moving in that direction a little.
Yeah, in a way, I've come to the point in my career where I do think about that, and I think about writing things that are more synthetic, um, and I feel like I don't, I can write a book for an academic press, and I can, I know how that's done, and I know what the audience is, and I just it's not about a wider readership. Um, it's about trying to bring together synthetically a lifetime of learning, and sometimes writing for university press is not the best is not the best avenue to do that. And a lot of look, we live in a scholarly world where a lot of people say, well, you're selling out, you're going to write a
Mm-hmm.
book for Simon and Schuster or something like that. I, I don't really see it that way. I mean, I think there's something about the scholarly guild that's very insular and elitist, and I think the great scholars um, actually are good at writing in that broader sense. And I think that that's more of like, okay, how many more years are going to be on this walking the planet, and what do I have left to say? And if I write for some academic press, it'll be read by colleagues, because that's what you're writing for when you're writing for an academic press, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
writing for colleagues mostly, as opposed to what are you going to leave behind?
Hmm. Yeah. Some of our guests have talked about like the kind of hustle involved in what they're doing. I'm just thinking of we're talking about being a public intellectual. What would you say to other academics who are thinking they want to be more in that space in terms of what they need to be doing themselves to place themselves there?
One thing I would say was develop thick skin, because it's the public intellectual world, especially in the age of social media, is a pretty rough neighborhood, and you really have to be able to take the hit, and again and again and again, and not the hit that you would take from a colleague who is criticizing you, but the hit that you're going to take from somebody who actually doesn't really know a whole lot, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
And whether you want to engage with that person, whether you want to basically say, okay, here's what you're saying, how about saying it this way, or what about thinking about it that way? So I think it requires dropping a certain kind of pretense of expertise, and creating some kind of environment of not an equal playing field per se, but to say, I can actually bring to the table something and have a conversation with somebody who, or an argument with somebody, which it really usually ends up being, with somebody who doesn't necessarily bring what I bring, but they do bring a perspective, and that I feel like I can contribute to. Not It's not about it. It's not about like helping a person understand something. It's about articulating what you know and what you want to say in a way that they could hear it. And I feel like for me, very often that exercise of articulation is beneficial
Mm.
for me as a writer. It
Hmm.
makes it makes me work harder
Hmm.
to to say something that's clearer. So it's not only altruism. I mean, it's egotism too. I mean, it's really about the self as much as about the broader society
Hmm.
that we live in. And really, okay, so it happens to be that Jewish studies, because of the world we live in, is relevant in a variety of different ways, or the study of Judaism, and what do we have to contribute to that conversation? And I perfectly understand somebody to say, I want to sit in my study in the library, I want to be in the archives, I don't really care about the world. My job is producing knowledge. That's a particular way of, it's kind of the, you know, Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog and fox, right? There are different ways of living in the world as a public person. But if somebody wants to do that, then it requires a certain kind of um, resilience, I would say.
Mm. From the outside, your life also seems very busy. It seems like you do a lot of conferences, speaking, involved in Jewish life too. Just curious how writing fits in, and if your process or preferences in terms of writing are things you've learned along the way. What works for you?
I think that we know everybody works differently. Um, I am a person who is basically writing all the time. Um, and when I'm not writing, I feel some kind of lack. So it may not be anything that's worth, maybe writing divrei Torah or writing a journal or writing something, but I feel like if I'm not working on something, and by working on something, I don't necessarily mean only research, but actually writing, it is I see it as my artistic expression. I mean, I went to college as a painting major, right? I
Wow.
mean, I wanted to be a painter,
Hmm.
and that's what I did for most of my adolescence, and ended up giving it up for a variety of reasons. But I feel like for me, writing is basically what painting was for me when I was younger, and what
Hmm.
painting is for a painter.
Hmm.
That's what they do. They paint,
Hmm.
and so that's how I do the work that I do. I you know I I'm an early riser, so for me, the morning hours are the best hours for writing. But I know that everyone has a different process.
Yeah. Um, One of the things we've been asking all of our guests is if there's something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career.
That's a great question. Um, that's a great question. I probably I look. I didn't come from a kind of intellectual home, so I didn't come from any kind of place where I understood the process of cultivating a kind of intellectual life. It was something that I learned, when I went to college, pretty much. And I think that had I been more exposed to writers, had I been more exposed to good writing as a young person, I think it would have helped me a lot. I really, I had to play catch up in a lot of ways, and in that sense, I feel like I kind of backed into academia, as opposed to somebody who, goes to an elite college and then goes to a graduate school. That wasn't what it was for me. I went to Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont. I went to an experimental college where it was like clothing optional, and then I went to university and I became frum, and then I became Haredi, and then I kind of like backed into it, and I think if I had more exposure early on to what the intellectual life was, I would have had a better head start, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like you've had many different lives. I don't know if all of us sound that way, though, when we start talking about how we used to be different at earlier
Right,
stages.
right, exactly. Yeah, I know. I grew up at a time and came into adulthood at a particular time in the '70s where there was a lot of options and there was a lot of opportunity and there was a lot of freedom, and especially for like a middle class kid. And I just took every opportunity. When I was 14 years old, I read Kerouac's On the Road, and I just said, "Oh wait, like this is like you can do this. This is possible." And I just that became a roadmap for me.
Hmm. Another question we've been asking folks is whether there is a writing practice that's been working for you.
I think the writing practice that works best for me, as I said earlier, is like writing earlier in the day is really good. But I'm the kind of person where I will, and I don't say this in any way that's edifying. Like I will like wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and think of a sentence that I don't think is good, and like turn on my computer and fix the sentence, and so in a way I'm kind of like I'm always kind of thinking about it. There's no separation between the product, or what I hope is the artistic product of writing, and myself. Like they're very, very intertwined, and I wouldn't want to give that up. I mean, I hope I never give that up. And I don't think that my life on the day to day would change after I retire, except for the fact that I won't be teaching classes. I mean, it's not that I'm going to just stop writing. I remember when Philip Roth said that he was going to stop writing at some point. It was like horrifying to me. Like how does a person like that, whose entire life was about words, that just said, okay, I'm done. On the one hand, it was admirable, and on the other hand, it was horrifying.
Yeah. No, I can relate to that too also. But I also feel, I mean, the time away from writing ends up being really helpful to me also. And I wonder if you too find that as much as we're kind of always writing, I do need to have periods of not writing to be able to go back to it sort of with freshness.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, it's just, you need to absorb the world. I mean, it's what traveling does. It's what being, we have a house in Vermont, which is really in the woods. And that is, it's an incredible privilege to be able to be in nature in that way, where you can just absorb in a very quiet way the world without having to actually sit down and put something down in words. But then at a certain point, it's like kind of like an itch in a way, like you want to.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Shaul. This has been really fun to get to talk to you about writing.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. I will say that it's the one thing I think that the academic discipline is really been deficient of, is really talking about writing and getting scholars to talk about writing. I mean, I have never seen a conversation, for example, just going back to someone like Harry Wolfson or Gershom Scholem, I don't know anything where they actually talked about writing.
Yeah. I mean, that was our feeling too, is this is so central to who we academics are, but there didn't seem to be enough conversation about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. And I hope I'll get to see you soon.
I hope so. You'll be in New York. I'm in New York all the time.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Talk to you later.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.